Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another weekly Wednesday webinar. And I'm delighted this evening to have Emina McLean from the Solar Lab at La Trobe, and also, as she described, lots of other bits and pieces in schools and other places. Emina is going to talk to us this evening about getting literacy right from the start, theory and practice. Without any further ado, I'll hand straight over to her.
Thank you, Michael. I'm just going to share my screen. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you tonight. I'm going to talk to you about really from research to practice and the challenge that we often face translating what we know in theory to what actually can work in practice. So it's called What's Involved in Getting Literacy Right from the Start. I'm going to share insights really from working with a number of schools on school improvement over the last few years, but also I'm going to be talking about the primary school that I work at. I'm very excited to see my principal, Adam Bright, in the audience. So at Docklands Primary School, which is a foundation primary school, opened its doors in term 1 this year. So it's a combination of things that I've tried to do and tried to learn over the last few years, and proposing one way that we can consider how to go about things. So I'm going to start with talking about some big picture puzzle pieces, and then I'm going to talk about some of the more, I suppose, granular level key considerations that we have. I'm just hearing that beeping sound coming through, but I don't think there's anything I can do about that. All right, so the first puzzle piece, I think, is curriculum. And I think that's the most essential starting point for us, is really focusing on the what that we're going to teach. Instruction and routine, so what our pedagogy is, what our approach to instruction is, and how we ensure that we have good and consistent instructional routines. Assessment, so how we're going to monitor what we're doing and how do we know that it works. We've got response to intervention, so thinking about that tiered style of support that we can provide. And promoting or developing practice excellence. So really investing in our staff and thinking how we develop both knowledge and expertise. So that's what I'm proposing are the 5 key big picture areas of focus. And within that, we've got what I think are 10 key things that we need to focus on within those 5 areas. So expectations, and that's expectations of staff, but also of students. Oral language, we know oral language is the essential foundation for literacy acquisition, and those who struggle with oral language tend to go on to struggle with literacy acquisition. We've got phonemic awareness, phonics plus, fluency and vocabulary, which are 4 of those 5 keys to reading. I've put phonics plus because I really want to propose tonight for us to be thinking about phonics, but as well phonology, orthography, morphology and etymology with respect to our reading and our spelling instruction. Fluency and vocabulary we know are critically important because they're that central connection point between word level reading and reading comprehension. So all too often I feel like those key connection points are forgotten or not focused on sufficiently. The importance of knowledge and building rich, deep knowledge across a range of subjects. The role of complex texts, reading comprehension, which is the other key to reading, and writing instruction. Now, within writing instruction, I want us to be thinking about handwriting and spelling, so thinking about the mechanics, but also sentence and paragraph level writing, the ability to plan, revise, pay attention, generate ideas. So writing really has a number of layers to it. And if I had enough room on my screen, I could have put another jigsaw piece for all of those different aspects of writing instruction. Interestingly, Timothy Shanahan, who was one of the authors of the National Reading Panel back in 2000, talking about the 5 keys to reading, so phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocab and reading comprehension, said that if he was to do the reading panel report all over again in this year, that he'd also add the role of complex texts, the role of writing instruction and the role of knowledge as being essential to what we do in literacy. And I really think it's important that we start to give them the space that they warrant within our curriculum and our teaching and our assessment. So the key questions that we really need to be able to consider and answer when we're developing or modifying our approach to literacy is, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? How are we doing it, or how well? When are we doing it, or how often? Where does it sit within our curriculum? So how much attention are we giving to it? We should be able to pinpoint exactly where we're addressing it. And we should be able to answer with what effect. So if we can't answer these questions, I'm going to pose that there's a problem with either what it is that we're doing or how we're doing it. So we should be able to at least have a pretty robust discussion in response to these questions. So hopefully those themes come through as we work our way through the presentation tonight. So curriculum is, I think, the essential first step. If we're not starting with a really solid foundation, no amount of quality explicit instruction, if our curriculum is really subpar, is going to achieve the desired outcomes, the outcomes we want for all of our students. So what we teach really matters, as well as the materials that we use in order to teach the what. So we know that curriculum is a critical factor in student success. We know that a common feature of academically high-performing schools is this comprehensive, content-rich curriculum. And we know that high-quality curriculum does give us the best chance of positively impacting learning, which is obviously what we want for all of our students. And within that, the cumulative effects of doing things right year after year after year. We know that it gives us the best chance of consistent learning within and across year levels. So if we're really clear on what it is we're teaching and the materials we're using in order to teach it, we can ensure that if we've got 5 or 6 foundation prep classrooms or 3 or 4 year one classrooms, that we're doing things consistently across each class. And we're laying the foundation for high quality instruction. So the quality of the curriculum drives the rigor in terms of the instruction. And it's our best chance of addressing equity issues, so being able to close the achievement gap or closing the gap between the haves and the have-nots upon entry to school. So that's our essential starting point. So in terms of the work that I've been doing in our foundation school, Docklands Primary School, and a few other schools in metropolitan and regional Victoria, the what, thinking about in foundational, that prep year, that first year of school, using the Sounds Right phonics program, and that's one of many high quality programs that are available. I'm certainly not advocating for that being the only program that we should consider. But the reason that I think it's a good choice is that it is so explicit and it's so clear in terms of documenting the what of our teaching. So we know exactly what we're teaching our prep students in the first year of school. Every prep student is learning at least 36 phoneme grapheme correspondences, because we've got 36 phoneme grapheme correspondences in our curriculum. They're learning initially how to read and spell 3 to 5 3-sound words, so CVC structure they start with, moving all the way through to 4 and 5-sound words. And you can see the range of structures that we have there. So VCC, CVC, we've got consonant clusters or adjacent consonants at the start or the end of words, really increasing in complexity through to consonant, 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 vowel, consonant structure. And they also learn 18 high frequency words that their knowledge of those 36 phoneme grapheme correspondences don't yet allow them to read, but we still approach those in a decodable manner, so working through the phoneme grapheme correspondences. So not working through them as sight words per se, or that traditional approach to teaching words as a whole. Then what that allows us to do, so choosing this curriculum allows us to move into what's called the extended code in the Sounds Right program. So that includes over 2 years, multiple spellings for 33 sounds and multiple sounds for 11 spellings. So it's really moving into that irregular aspect of the code. So working through, okay, we've got this sound, but here are the 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 different ways that we can spell that. And then looking beyond those first 3 years, and really, I hope that comes through as a strong message tonight, looking beyond phonics instruction. So phonology and orthography being that essential foundation, but what next? So in my context, we're using spelling mastery from year 3 onward, and that maps to the levels C through to F. And And the reason for that, again, like sounds right, it's a direct instruction program. All of the lessons are planned ahead of time, which allows teachers to then focus on the how and ensuring high quality instruction. But there's a focus on all of the aspects of spelling, so phonology, orthography, morphology, and etymology in a really structured way. Students coming to our school this year have had a number of gaps in their learning. So even in our grade 5-6 classroom, we've got reading and spelling ability from a grade 1 through to about a year 8 level, because they've all had a range of approaches to teaching and learning. They all missed a bit of school last year. So we've had to start out teaching level C in our grade 3-4 classes and level D in our grade 5-6 classes. But the idea over time, as students come through having experienced high quality, consistent instruction, is that that will become a more consistent process across levels C to F. So why do we do that? We've got converging evidence supporting systematic explicit phonics instruction using a scope and sequence, and we've known this for 20+ years now. So that information's been around for a good while. And we've got triple word form theory that proposes that spelling development is relying on this development of phonology, orthography, and morphology, and that etymology is part of that. So that all three are developing in the primary years and they're interrelated. And phonology and orthography tend to be a focus earlier on, but as quickly as possible, we need to be bringing in morphology and etymology for spelling development, but there's also a link there to vocabulary instruction. In terms of fluency, so one of those essential keys to reading and essential connection points between word level reading and reading comprehension. So modelling and monitoring of accuracy rate and expression in read alouds and in shared reading lessons. Fluency benchmarks 3 times a year and an end of year goal for each student from the end of year 1. So we start to set an end of year target for what we expect of our students. 10 to 15 minutes per day of explicit fluency practice or instruction. So using either decodable readers that match the phonics unit that's being taught or other suitable passages from class texts for those older students who are no longer using decodable readers. And we know that really from the fluency research that it tends to indicate that that amount of time is what's required. So we've got whole class choral reading. Teacher reads the passage orally once the teacher once, and then the teacher and student read it aloud together. Repeated reading, so this can be timed or untimed. So the teacher's modelling reading of a short passage. Recommendations are usually around 50 to 200 words, no more than that. Then students read the text 3 times with feedback provided on accuracy rate and expression. And you can do that in a range of ways. And then we've got paired student reading. So students take turns reading, students read aloud together, and they're paired with a stronger and a weaker reader. So partner 1 reads the stronger reader and then partner 2 repeats after having a good example. So why do we do that? Like I've been saying, fluency is one of the 5 keys to reading, and it's one of 2 linchpins connecting our word level reading and reading comprehension. We're going to talk about knowledge next. So why do we have a focus on knowledge? And in particular, we use the core knowledge curriculum. So we know that knowledge enables or improves reading comprehension. Kids that know a lot of stuff about a lot of stuff bring a lot to the text, and therefore they're better at reading comprehension because they know about what they're reading about. Knowledge begets knowledge. So the more we know, the more stuff we have to attach to when we're experiencing, when we're reading or whether someone's teaching us. Social mobility requires knowledge or requires cultural literacy. And we want that for all of our students. So we want to set them up for agency in life. Knowledge improves our capacity to think. So knowledge is what we think with. And the core knowledge curriculum, which I'll link to in a minute, is currently, in my view, the best available knowledge-rich curriculum that we have available for primary school students. So you can read a really great paper that's come out of the Solar Lab by Reed Smith, Pam Snow, Tanya Sari, and Lorraine Hammond. So the role of background knowledge in reading comprehension. The Knowledge Gap by Natalie Wexler. That book really clearly outlines the critical importance of knowledge and background knowledge. And there's a link there. I'll make my slides available. There's a link to downloading and having a look at some of the units and lessons available through the Core Knowledge Foundation. So really a focus on setting up students to develop this rich, deep knowledge that they're able to bring to literacy. So what do we cover? really mapping out the curriculum across each year level so we know which units of knowledge or what knowledge we're teaching in which year level, and making sure that it's cumulative. So if something's covered in prep, that it's revisited in year 1 in more detail, it's revisited maybe in year 2 or year 3 in more detail, and so on. So constantly adding to knowledge over time. English, geography, history and science curricula. So not really thinking about literacy as just belonging in literacy or just belonging in the subject of English, that literacy is embedded across subjects. Having read aloud anthologies, so these are a part of the core knowledge curriculum. So read aloud anthologies and student readers, which allows for daily reading aloud, daily shared reading once students are at that point of being able to take turns reading at a whole class level. And accountable independent reading. So that comes out of the work of Doug Lemov in Reading Reconsidered, this idea that we don't just set endless independent reading tasks for students, we set short bursts of independent reading with accountability tasks. So it might be read and then you've got a sentence level writing task that you might have to do, or you read a little section and then you're going to be asked some check for understanding questions. So it's important within that to have this focus on the quantity of reading, but also the quality of reading, and getting that nice balance between reading aloud to students, students actually taking turns reading, and students building their independence with reading as well, but in a really structured way. So what we're able to do through a core knowledge curriculum is to embed reading comprehension, vocabulary instruction and writing instruction in every single lesson in all of those subjects. So across English, across geography, across history and across science. So in all of those subjects, they're reading, they're learning vocab and they're writing. Another advantage in terms of saving time and being able to focus on honing our craft is that units and lessons are already planned. So if you've got a unit on Greek myths, the whole unit's planned out and sequenced, and every single lesson is available, which allows you to really focus on how you're going to teach and developing your instruction. So within our context at Docklands Primary School, we've got 5 hours of English per week, and then 5 hours of history, geography and science per week, but looking to possibly increase that in the upper years. So looking at 10 hours per week of structured reading comprehension, structured vocabulary and structured writing instruction. So the downside is that the core knowledge curriculum comes out of the US and it is quite American centric across a little bit in English, but more so in the history and the geography curriculum. So there are some tweaks that do need to be made. And the other thing is I think some of the vocabulary instruction can be a bit more robust, and we've been doing some of that work to build our vocab instruction, as can the reading comprehension instruction. It can be a bit more robust. So individual schools can tweak that. In my current context, we're partnering with the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies to embed really knowledge-rich Our Land, Our Stories text-based units of study for lower, middle and upper primary school to develop our history units that are relevant for the Australian context. So it is important to note that there are some downfalls there. It's not a perfect curriculum. So curriculum for vocabulary is taught primarily through the core knowledge units across English, history, geography and science. Incidental vocabulary is a big part of it, but within that we still document the words that are going to be incidentally taught or revisited just a few times. So that's documented in a scope and sequence. Explicit vocabulary instruction in the core knowledge curriculum, it's called word work, where there's elaborated attention, lots of questions, lots of discussion, lots of examples in order to embed that vocabulary in long-term memory. So words are pre-selected for each unit and for each lesson. There's an additional focus on morphology and etymology in the upper years, and make as many links as possible through that to spelling instruction. And so what it gives you is this instant vocabulary curriculum across the whole school. So from prep to 6, you know exactly the words you're going to teach, both incidentally and explicitly. So you've got a scope and sequence for each year level. So you know in each unit of study, in each term, the words that students are learning. So they're learning general academic vocabulary, so there's tier 2 words, as well as the vocabulary for each discipline or area of study. So we know that developing vocab within particular domains is a really key part of developing that relevant background knowledge. So I've added there a link to Alex Quigley's 3 pillars of vocabulary teaching. He's written a really recent blog post on those 3 essential elements of effective vocabulary instruction. So incidental vocab instruction, explicit vocab instruction, and also developing this word interest or curiosity or passion within our classrooms. So what a bit of our vocab scope and sequence now looks like is in prep and grade 1, just in the first few units for this year, these are all the words that they've been exposed to. So the words in bold are the words that have had elaborated attention, really explicit instruction, and the words that are not in bold, they've still had a fair amount of incidental exposure to those words. So that's just for our 5 and 6-year-olds really, some 7-year-olds, just in the first few units of this year. So you can see in this way, quite quickly, you're developing really rich and comprehensive tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary. There are some tier 1 words in there, and that's quite important in our setting at Docklands Primary School because we've got 60% plus students have English as an additional language. So the next thing, I know this is a whirlwind tour, the next thing I want to talk about is the importance of text selection and really thinking about the books that we read, why we read them. So the issue we have in Australia and internationally is that students are not well prepared to read the text that they'll encounter post-school, at work or at university. And in primary school, we don't do a very good job at preparing students to read the books that they're going to encounter in secondary school either. Particularly, we don't prepare them to read the non-fiction that they're going to encounter in secondary school. So we have to think about texts carefully. I'm just going to talk you through the Achieve the Core test out of the US, what it demonstrated about the importance of text selection, in particular, the importance of selecting complex texts for students to read. So we've got on the y-axis the average percent of questions correct. On the x-axis, we've got their reading test score. The dotted line, the dotted vertical line is the reading benchmark. And then they were asked questions, the solid black line, that it was literal questions they were asked, and the solid red line is the inferential questions they were asked. So you can see whether you're above or below the reading benchmark. There's no real difference, whether you're a poor reader or a good reader, there's no real difference in your ability to answer literal or inferential questions, which is pretty interesting given the attention literal versus inferential questions have had over the years. So poor readers, their ability to answer either type of question was the same. Good readers, their ability to answer either type of question was the same. If we look at some different types of questions, so asking questions about the main idea, asking questions about supporting details, relationships, the meanings of words, any generalizations they could make, any conclusions they could make. Again, you see there's no real difference in ability here. Whether you're a good reader or you're a poor reader, your ability to answer all of those types of questions is much the same. Where we see the real variability is on this final slide. So they were asked questions based on uncomplicated texts, questions based on more challenging texts, and questions based on complex texts. And you can see the lowest performing students, their ability was much of a muchness for all 3 types of texts or levels of difficulty. And if you're in the top kind of 2–3% of students, so the absolute highest achievers, their ability to answer those 3 types of questions was much the same. But for anybody in the middle, there was huge variability in their ability to answer questions relating to uncomplicated, more challenging and complex texts. And by this point in time, these students, it's not that these texts were too complex for them to know about or be able to respond to these questions. It was more so the preparation in their primary and secondary schooling had not prepared them to be able to really closely read, pay attention to and analyse the meaning of texts. So the key takeaway here is that we need to do better in teaching students how to read more complex texts in order to set them up for success in secondary school, but also beyond secondary school. So we do have this pervasive myth that students learn better or best with these easier texts. And this is particularly prevalent in primary schools, but some of it flows on into secondary school as well. That students learn better with instructional level texts. And we know that schools routinely teach students with below grade level texts. But unfortunately, we know that studies have demonstrated that matching text to students' ability doesn't improve reading achievement over time. And we see that reading achievement just plateaus. We know the opposite is true. So teaching reading using texts that are challenging seems to yield the biggest gains, particularly if we're teaching students using texts at the frustration level. And I'll talk about frustration level on the next slide. So if texts are too easy, students won't learn to read complex texts. But if texts are too complex, without careful teacher mediation and scaffolding, students won't be able to access them. So texts need to be hard enough to pose comprehension challenges to be facilitated by the teacher. Otherwise, reading comprehension is not evolving. So you've probably all seen these levels before. They play a big role in text selection in majority of primary schools in Australia. The idea that there's this independent reading level where we've got virtually perfect fluency and close to perfect comprehension, this instructional reading level where you've got close to perfect fluency and comprehension still pretty high, and then there's this frustration reading level where fluency has got huge variability and comprehension something between 0 and 50%. The idea, if we're wanting to build students' capacity to read complex texts, we need to be exposing them to more text at this frustration level. So these levels have been around for, the theories behind them have been around for a long time. So these three levels in independent, instructional and frustration reading level really came about through the work of Bett. And 1946 was when her theory was proposed, this instructional level theory. And she said the student reading level should match the text level. So they should be the same. We shouldn't be giving students texts that are beyond what their current reading level is. And the idea is that learning happens when students have good comprehension. And this is where the origins of sort of PM benchmarking, Fontes and Pinnell guided reading levels, or the idea of just right books comes from. Back in the 40s, that was the origin there. Whereas a bit later on, Powell came up with his mediated text theory, and he said we have a student reading level, we have adult mediation, so the role of the teacher, and then we've got the text level. And the idea is that we're constantly exposing students to texts that are beyond their independent reading level, but through adult mediation, we're able to facilitate access to that complexity and teach students how to be able to access and read those complex texts. So he said that learning happens when access to harder texts is facilitated by an expert reader. So that's really gone into a lot of my thinking around what we're doing at Docklands Primary School, and a lot of the other work I'm doing in schools on school improvement is this idea of what are the complex texts that we're reading, how are we supporting students to be better at reading harder texts. So supported opportunities to confront complex texts thoughtfully and carefully will build ability. So that's a central belief. Texts are considered complex for two reasons. So they might have linguistic complexity or they might have content or background knowledge complexity. And Doug Lemov and his colleagues in their book Reading Reconsidered talk about the 6 text types that really can be disruptive to comprehension, complex texts, and therefore they make good choices if we're trying to expose students to complex texts. So we've got archaic texts, so words that have texts that have different words and syntax. They come from sort of 50 plus years ago, where there was different vocabulary and different ways of forming sentences, word order in sentences in particular. Text with non-linear time sequence, so we're not really sure about how consistently time's passing. Complexity of the narrator, so there might be lots of narrators, there might be non-human narrators, there might be narrators who mislead us and deceive us, or there might be narrators who have an unclear role or identity in the text. Texts that have complexity of story, so there might be plots or symbols that really disorientate the reader. Or there's comprehension resistant text. So it might be that authors have deliberately written things really in complex and dense ways. And the last one is non-fiction. And non-fiction is also something that has not had enough attention to it for a long time, particularly in primary school. So in terms of the text that our students are exposed to, it's at least 50-50. In fact, it's probably more like 60-40. So there's a high volume of non-fiction text that they're exposed to build knowledge, but to also build reading comprehension or ability to read that style of text, which is very different to narrative text. Informational text has a really different structure in terms of sentences, but the text overall. And so our non-fiction can be standalone, or it can be embedded. So for example, if you're developing text units that are narrative text, based on narrative texts, you can easily embed bursts of nonfiction. So you might find pieces of information that are actually going to build background knowledge. So a good example of that is a text unit I've developed for our setting for our grade 4 curriculum, which is the Stormboy novella. And it's all about South Australia, Goolwa, the Coorong, so that sanctuary and national park. So there's bursts of informational text that have been embedded in that text unit to build background knowledge, which means students then bring back more to the actual text and it boosts their reading comprehension. But they're being exposed to narrative informational, and learning to be able to switch between the two as well. So what that's allowed us to develop is a reading spine in our setting. For each year level, there's a list of books that are put into each of those categories that can really disrupt reading comprehension. So it's not necessarily that teachers are expected to read all of these books with their students across the course of the year, and our knowledge curriculum takes up a significant portion of our teaching, but it's if they're going to be doing read alouds or shared reading instruction that this is the list to choose from. And the idea is that teachers will be choosing at least one from archaic text, one from nonlinear time sequence, one from narratively complex, and so on across the course of the year. It's less important in grades 4, 5 and 6 because we have a lot of novel units or text-based units in our curriculum, but in the earlier years where the books are shorter as well, the expectation is that teachers will be able to read and discuss and expose students to at least a few books from each category over the course of the year. So really having that focus on the layers that make up reading comprehension. And the way that I conceptualize reading comprehension, and interestingly, we don't really have an agreed upon definition of reading comprehension in the literature, but we have these layers and we're trying to have a key focus on all of these key aspects. So there's the knowledge and skills for reading. So what students are able to bring to the text, their skill set, if you like. So it's their word level reading, their oral reading fluency, their oral and written language skills. So knowing about sentence structure and text structure as well. Their background knowledge, so how much stuff do they know? Vocabulary, so tier 2 and tier 3 words. So that's the first focus, is getting those foundations right, because we want students to be able to bring all of that stuff to the text. So that frees up their cognitive capacity to actually focus on what it is that they're reading. Then we're going to focus on the knowledge of reading as this active process. So what can they actually do while they're reading? So can they actively read, closely read for meaning? Can they establish meaning? Can they make connections while they're reading? Can they analyze meaning? Are they able to use effective strategies like summarization and questioning? Do they know what to do when they get stuck? And then there's this product of reading comprehension. So what can they actually take away from the text? So having a real focus on getting them writing afterward, discussing afterward, analysing afterward, and having these short bursts of reading with writing or discussion embedded in there. So it is important, I think, when we're planning our curriculum, when we're planning our instruction, that we think about these layers that there are to reading comprehension, laying the foundations and then building that challenge through complex text exposure. And I've just put there, note, certainly our curriculum at Docklands is novel, what I call novel centric from grade 4 onward, which means while we continue to teach our core knowledge units, we start to embed a lot of text-based units of study, particularly in grade 5 and 6. So in our grade 4 curriculum, I think there's 3 or 4 novel units that they read across the course of the year. But from next year, our grade 5, 6 curriculum will be predominantly novels within the domain of English. They'll still have their core knowledge units across other subjects. In terms of writing, So having a particular focus on sentence level instruction. And we know that sentences are the building blocks for writing. And historically in Australia, we haven't had enough attention to sentence level instruction. So in terms of our curriculum at Docklands Primary School and some of the other schools that I'm working with, really getting students to be able to identify the difference between sentences and fragments, what a sentence is and what a sentence isn't. What makes a sentence? Is this a sentence? Is it not? And these ideas come from the writing revolution or the Hockman method. Scramble sentences, so being given sentences that are in the incorrect order and being able to reorder them in ways that make semantic and syntactic sense. Run-on sentences and learning how to stop and create a new sentence, or how to appropriately connect ideas in writing rather than getting this and in their writing. Learning the sentence types. So what's a statement? You know, what's a question? What's an exclamation? What's a command? What do those sentences look like? How do we form them? When do we use them? Being able to develop questions, learning how to use basic conjunctions, learning how to use more complex, so subordinating conjunctions, learning how to insert appositives or those descriptive noun phrases in writing, learning how to combine sentences. So being given 2 to 4 simple sentences and combining them all into quite a complex sentence. Sentence expansion, so being given the bare bones of a sentence and making it more complex and more interesting. And then there's lots of other things that we focus on as well. So handwriting is a big focus, and I'll talk about that in a bit, but 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes of explicit handwriting instruction and practice every day from prep through to at least grade 3. How to take notes and reduce information to the absolute bare essentials, how to remove redundant information, how to summarize what you've read, how to plan paragraphs and then how to write them, how to plan compositions, so multiple paragraph outlines or plans, and then how to write multiple paragraphs, how to revise your work, how to capitalize, how to punctuate, how to vary your vocabulary. So you've used the word good here. Good's not a very good word. What's another word that we could use? How can we be more precise or interesting or exact? How to write introductions, how to write conclusions, writing for different purposes and for different audiences. So being really explicit about how we teach these and when we teach these various skills. Okay, the essential link, I think, between the curriculum and what happens in the classroom and what happens in our classroom planning is the idea of having a scope and sequence document. So what we've developed for both reading and writing is detailed scope and sequences, so we know exactly what we're teaching, when we're teaching it, for each area that we're focusing on term by term. So this is the unpopulated version of what our reading scope and sequence looks like, and we have it for each year level. So what are we teaching for word level reading in prep, for example? In term 1, what are we teaching? What are we teaching in term 2, 3 and 4? For fluency, what are we focusing on? For vocabulary, which words are we teaching? For reading comprehension, the knowledge or skills involved, concepts of print and screen, which links to the Victorian and Australian curriculum. And then for writing, again, this is unpopulated, but what we've got documented for each term, for each year level, for each of these areas is exactly what we're teaching and when we're teaching it. So spelling, handwriting, etymology and morphology, and there's some obviously links between our spelling instruction and our etymology morphology, and with our vocabulary as well. So getting students to be able to write and use in their spoken language the vocabulary that they're learning in English, science, humanities, geography. What we're teaching for sentence level writing, what we're teaching for paragraph level writing, what students are learning to do with editing and revising, grammar, word knowledge and linguistic features, and punctuation. So that is all documented, and you can readily track through the year levels this cumulative idea. So, okay, what do we teach in prep? So how are we building on that in grade 1? So we're revising, and then we're going to further develop the knowledge or skills that we're talking about. So it's essential that we're able to be clear on what it is we're teaching and why. I want to talk about instruction now and this need to think about how we're teaching, what our pedagogy is. So being clear about what we know about the evidence for explicit teaching. So we know we've got explicit instruction that's teacher-led, and we've got inquiry or discovery-based learning that's student-led. We know on the far left, this is what works best when we're learning something new or we're a novice. So regardless of our age, if we're learning something new, we're going to benefit from explicit teaching, someone expert teaching us and showing us how to do it. Toward the right, we're becoming expert, developing expertise, and once we're an expert, that we're quite equipped to be to lead our own learning or to consolidate our own learning. And everything in the middle is developing ability, and we still need that teacher input, significant teacher input in that period. So this idea that we have this gradual release of responsibility. And in the work that we've done at Docklands Primary School, we were really upfront with staff at the start of the year that this is the approach and this is what we believe in, and had really strong support from leadership around this. And we've got a brilliant instructional coach who's leading a lot of this work around how we teach and what the thinking is behind it. So I've just linked to the bottom there, the Kirshner-Swiller-Clark paper on why minimal guidance during instruction doesn't work, and Pearson and Gallagher were the ones who came up with this gradual release of responsibility model. But really being clear and having this belief as a school and having that part of the culture, the role of explicit teaching and when that is required and what that actually looks like. And that most of the time in a lot of what we do, our students are novices, and that's our pedagogy of choice. So a lot of this work on instruction is informed by Rosenshine's principles of instruction. This idea that we have daily review, we're constantly revisiting what it is that we've taught. We're presenting new material using small, manageable steps, so it's not too much, too fast, too soon. Asking lots of questions, providing models, guiding student practice, regularly checking for understanding, obtaining high success rate and having great expectations of all our students. This idea that we're aiming for 80% success based on the teaching that we're doing, and through differentiated support, we're aiming to get close to 100% success in everything that we're teaching. So high expectations. Providing scaffolds for difficult tasks, independent practice, and weekly and monthly review. So these have been around for quite some time now, that we have these ways of sequencing concepts and modelling in order for students to see all of the relevant steps. The role of questioning being essentially important, and how important it is to continue to review to prevent that forgetting cycle over time. And that there are stages of practice, and we need to be really deliberate in the ways that we approach practice. And the other key body of work that really is in motion, but certainly is reflected in unit plans and lesson plans, is this concept of explicit direct instruction. So capital EDI as per the Hollingsworth work. So that each lesson, it doesn't work for every single lesson. Things like read alouds, it doesn't necessarily map on neatly to, but for a lot of what we're teaching, these are the key lesson plan components. So always start, non-negotiable, always start with this learning objective. So being really clear on what we're going to teach. Activating prior knowledge, so reviewing what was previously taught and talk about how this connects. Concept development, so explaining any new words or concepts with labelled examples. Skill development, completing worked examples with modelling and thinking aloud. Guided practice, so students complete further examples with teacher assistance. Relevance, so stating how and why this skill or knowledge is important. Closure, just students describe what they've learned. The teacher has students work through a task to check they're ready for independent practice, and then they're released for independent practice. So that's built in, certainly in English and literacy and across the other domains. We're working on this in maths at the moment too, but really having this set sequence reflecting how it is that students learn as novices. And then there's key aspects within the lesson. So always teach first. So not expecting students to be able to know anything or do anything unless we've taught it first. Ask specific questions about what we've taught, including checking for understanding questions. So having that as part of the lesson planning. So what are the questions I'm going to ask to check whether or not they've learned what I've taught? Pair share, really building that into their daily instructional routine, that students are routinely discussing with their partners what they've learned. This idea of cold calling or picking non-volunteers and making sure we're checking in on the thinking of all of our students, not leaving anyone out. Listening to responses and effective feedback. So always reteach as required if students haven't gotten it. And that developing as part of culture that it's never the student's fault. We don't blame the students, it's we are prepared to examine and re-examine our teaching and improve our teaching, improve our instruction. A few other things that I've been doing, and we've spent the first term this year on really doing this idea of working the clock or maximising time on task. And I think it's critically important. A lot of time, unless we're really intentional about how we use time, a lot of time can get lost throughout the course of the day, which results in hours, days, who knows, weeks across the course of the school year. So measuring time, and I'm recommending in all the schools that I work in that the teachers have timers, and at Docklands we've got teachers starting to really intentionally, strategically use time. But measure time, your greatest resource as a teacher, intentionally, strategically, and often visibly to shape both your and your students' experience in the classroom. So showing the clock, making time visible, showing how you track the passage of time. This can help students be more attentive and mindful and sends the message that there's careful and wise allocation to certain tasks. And it's a really useful tool for teachers to discipline themselves too. Use specific and odd increments. So not saying something like, oh, we'll just spend the next 5 minutes on this or the next 10 minutes on this, because they contain this kind of approximately, and we're so desensitized to those measures of time, and time passes and more time gets spent than we intend. So being specific and holding students accountable. So exactly 5 minutes, or using odd numbers like exactly 3 minutes, and get both teacher and student to be more mindful of time passing. Setting goals, so making time management a team sport, setting goals as a teacher for yourself and setting goals for students. So aiming to accomplish things with efficiency. And using countdowns. And this is built into a lot of the explicit direct instruction work, but using countdowns for simple tasks, it's great for routines and behaviour management, great for transitions, but the aim is to transition to less narrated countdowns over time. So there's a lot of that counting down, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. But if students are actually finishing off tasks, sometimes this can be actually quite disruptive to their thinking. So the idea is you work toward students listening for an alarm or a beeper or a timer to keep them on task. Every minute matters. Again, this comes from the work of Teach Like a Champion, Doug Lemov's work. So respecting students' time and their learning opportunities by spending every minute productively. Recalibrate thinking from only 2 minutes left to there's still 2 minutes left. In terms of early literacy instruction, there's quite a bit you can get done in 2 minutes if it's around, say, phoneme, grapheme correspondences. Believe in how much can be accomplished in short periods, and have back pocket activities and questions ready. So independent, high value activities ready for students each lesson as part of planning that they can complete if there's a disruption or teachers need to be doing something else. So what that kind of work has led to in our planning at Docklands Primary School is this development of timetables and routines. I'm going to show you an example of the prep core literacy morning block, but it took really a term of work on this to get some consistency around how time was used. So this is now what the first hour in every prep classroom looks every day. So there's the first 5 minutes of the day on admin, taking the role, greeting students, whatever needs to be done. But at 9:05, the expectation now is that every lesson starts and they've got half an hour for their phonics block. So sounds right. There's 2 lessons in that half an hour. So there's usually 15 minutes each. Sometimes the split, depending on the lessons, is more like 20 or 10. There's set words. So across each classroom, across the 6 classrooms, the words that they're teaching, that they're reading and spelling are exactly the same. And there's set phoneme, grapheme correspondences for each fortnight. So the idea is that there's 2 weeks that they will spend on a phoneme, grapheme correspondence unit. So there might be, 3 or 4 different phoneme grapheme correspondences they're learning to read and spell across a fortnight. So getting that consistency. Then there's 15 minutes for handwriting instruction, and that handwriting is based on the phonics lessons. So practicing handwriting the graphemes that are relating to what they're learning with phoneme grapheme correspondences. And then there's 10 minutes for oral reading fluency practice. But this work did take, it did take a full term to really get this routine down pat, and doing a lot of observation, doing a lot of modelling. So I did a lot of modelling with teachers around the pace and how to fit all of this into that 1 hour block. A lot of coaching and support to get this running smoothly. But we were wrapped to do a walkthrough a couple of weeks ago and to see that this was running really uniformly and running so well, and the teachers have done an amazing job. But it just means that there's equal opportunity. So no matter which prep class that you're in, your instruction is the same, and you're having the same teaching and learning opportunities, which is something to really celebrate. So just put that note there that there's this core literacy skills block that we have across prep to 6, rather than just this kind of 2 hour literacy block. So we have a core literacy skills block for the first hour each day in each year level, where it's word level reading, spelling, it's handwriting, and it's oral reading fluency. It's a bit more like 45 minutes in the upper primary school. And then English is taught as a subject. So it's like it's a subject for history or for science or geography. English is a separate subject where they study poetry and they study different texts. So it's just this one core hour of skills. And the idea is that students are set up to then take those skills to any discipline or any subject that they have across the school day. Assessment. So universal screening, so 3 times a year for key knowledge and skills in the literacy domain. There's additional progress monitoring for students who struggle, and these are based on response to intervention principles and the response to intervention research. Students who need additional progress monitoring really need assessment about every 3 weeks, and students who are receiving strategic support, so more like that tier 2 intervention, need progress monitoring every 3 to 5 weeks. In the early years, we prioritise the fundamentals of language and reading. We continue to monitor reading and writing skills throughout primary school, and formative assessment is daily, weekly, and monthly. So conducted through checking for understanding questions, daily review, weekly review, and monthly review. So the idea that there's different types of assessment for different purposes. So this is the assessment schedule that we've developed at Docklands, and it really is reflecting the simple view of reading and the 5 keys to reading, but also the science of learning, the science of writing. So most of these assessments are free and available online, and they assess what we really want to be measuring, and they reflect what it is that we're teaching as well. So really intentional about the assessment choices. So using DIBBLES, so the subtests are letter naming fluency, word reading fluency, non-word reading fluency, phoneme segmentation fluency, oral reading fluency, and comprehension. The reason that they have fluency in the title is because they're timed time tests. So what can you do in 1 minute? Cubed is a linguistic comprehension measure. So we're using that in foundation through to year 2 as a way of screening for oral language difficulties, and also monitoring their English development for our students who are learning English as an additional language. So again, it's quite a short assessment conducted 3 times a year, looking at listening comprehension, story retell, story grammar, vocab development, and use of coordinating and subordinating conjunctions. Moving across to spelling, so we use the freely available motive spelling assessments, and the COST, which is the components of spelling test created by Tessa DeFern. So the diagnostic spelling test for sounds, diagnostic spelling test for non-words, and the diagnostic spelling test for irregular words. That's done in term 3. So the DISC tests are done in term 3 across F2. And then the COST is assessing phonology, orthography, and morphology, and that's done once a year across 3 to 6. So really in the upper primary school, looking at how those 3 essential components of spelling are coming together. Comparative judgment and writing moderation. So that's writing moderation is done twice a year. We really still need to refine that process. And comparative judgment is something that's new. I think I saw Jeanette Green in the audience before. Comparative judgment comes from the work of Daisy Christodoulou and No More Marking in the UK. But we're trialling that at the moment as a way of assessing writing as it's developing for our Year 3 students. But it's really important to be monitoring that writing development. And over time, we're really hoping to build in start of the year and end of the year writing to prompts based on the Writing Revolution work that we're doing. PAT reading comprehension once a year from Year 1 to 6. The phonics screening check in Year 1, that happens in term 3. And then there's PAT grammar and punctuation is being done in 3 to 6 once a year. So what this really allows is for us to be monitoring most of the areas of reading and writing that it is that we're teaching, and to have those benchmark points for Dibbles and Cube really allows us to assess whether or not what we're doing is working over time. So selecting and administering assessments, it's important that we select screening tasks that yield meaningful data, reflect the knowledge and skills we're going to be teaching, like I just said, reflect the research on learning, reading and writing, are tied to expectations for learning, they're technically adequate, they're valid and reliable. And it's important that staff are trained to administer correctly, especially for adopting new measures, that there's scripted instructions or at least guidance around the steps to follow, and observation coaching occurs during initial administration and scoring. And ideally, based on RTI recommendations, we cross-check a percentage of assessments for scoring reliability. So another key aspect is this response to intervention framework. So this idea that we have these 3 tiers of instruction or intervention or support. So our core instruction with universal screening and progress monitoring and differentiated support for students within that whole class instruction. And that this should be sufficient for 70 to 90% of students. Tier 2 is that supplemental instruction. So it's aiming to top up Tier 1 instruction. It should be matched to Tier 1 instruction. Small group, frequent progress monitoring, and there'll be about 10 to 25% of students who need this additional small group support. Then there'll be students with persistent difficulties and they need intensive intervention and individualised program and frequent progress monitoring. And somewhere between 2 to 10% of students need this support. So developing core instruction and intervention program has been a core part of the work. So whole class best practice instruction, small group time limited additional instruction, and the guidelines are 3 to 5 students, ideally something like 3 to 30-minute sessions a week, a bit of variation there. It's an increased dose of Tier 1 instruction. Small groups allow for more explicit instruction, feedback and practice. And then Tier 3 specialist education, 1 to 3 students, high dose, increased frequency, highly targeted, sustained duration. And this idea that we increase rather than decrease the expertise of the interventionist as we move through the tiers. So the non-negotiables, strong core instruction at Tier 1, using whenever possible validated instructional techniques or programs. Universal screening of all students for difficulties upon entry to school. Progress monitoring for students at risk. All students are in this, what we call surveillance system, where their risk and learning progress is identified quickly. Where large numbers of students perform below criteria, we really have to look at our core instruction, that Tier 1 instruction, before we think about individual support. And students who don't respond in this timely manner to core instruction get additional support. Students who continue to struggle get that more comprehensive assessment. So what this enables is we know how all of our students are going with all aspects of literacy learning, really at any given point in time. We can modify or increase instruction for those who are struggling. We select and refine instructional techniques based on evidence showing they work, and we continue to evaluate our efforts to see whether we're positively impacting learning. So really setting teachers with instruction up for success, but also ensuring we're setting students up for success and giving them the best possible chance. Finally, I just want to talk about practice excellence. So this idea of developing and promoting teacher expertise, having it as a shared goal and a shared responsibility, really fostering this desire for knowledge and practice improvement and needing to embed that. Having a low variance and high fidelity curriculum, instruction and routines, this idea of consistency within and between year levels. Really investing in professional learning. So we're really fortunate at Docklands to have weekly Monday professional learning, happens every week, but formal training. So for example, in the Sounds Right program or the Writing Revolution, so extended professional learning in that domain. We've set up learning walks, so twice a term, leadership and or a group of teachers with leadership walk through the school and observe all the teachers in action and develop feedback of what's going really well and what needs to be continued focus for practice improvement. Regular observation and feedback, and like I said earlier, we're lucky to have an instructional coach who does a lot of that work. Modelling, so I've been working with our prep team over the last couple of terms on really delivering lessons and discussing the key components and modelling pace and modelling cold calling and modelling feedback, modelling error correction and things like that. Inbuilt coaching cycles, developing some video exemplars, so capturing really good practice to have on record and for points of discussion, and mentoring. So what we've been able to do is pull together, and these are documented front and centre in our scope and sequences through all of this work, that we have these big ideas or key beliefs. So for reading, our instruction is explicit across all aspects of reading using I do, we do, you do. Our teaching is aligned with the science of reading and science of learning. Vocab and reading comprehension are embedded in a knowledge-rich curriculum. We have a big focus on the 5 keys to reading. We know that background knowledge, vocab, and knowledge of sentence and text structure influence reading comprehension. Strategy-based instruction helps, but instruction should be brief rather than extended. We read and discuss grade level text daily. We regularly check for understanding. We give students multiple opportunities for practice. We give explicit feedback. We complete regular reviews, and we ensure fidelity with our approaches and programs. And we've done the same for writing. So our instruction's explicit. Our teaching's aligned with the science of learning and writing. Writing instructions embedded within a knowledge-rich curriculum. Students should be writing about what they're learning and reading about across subjects every day. As well as explicit writing instruction at the sentence level and beyond, writing volume matters, and research evidence shows that good writing outcomes from at least an hour per day of instruction. So aiming for at least an hour of instruction a day across subjects. Writing instruction improves reading comprehension. Sentence level writing instruction precedes extended text generation. So we know sentences are the building blocks of writing. We have a big focus on the keys to writing. So transcription, text generation, executive function and working memory. We regularly check for understanding. We give students multiple opportunities for practice, feedback, regular reviews, and we ensure fidelity. So making these front and center and things that people are seeing and thinking about regularly. And that's the end. Thanks for listening.
Well, I'd just like to say, first of all, thanks so much, Emina, for that presentation. I think it was, in my perspective, incredibly comprehensive and succinct all at the same time. I'm not sure if they can be both together, but that's how I would sum that up. And I was just incredibly impressed. So thank you so much. And I know there's lots of feedback and lots of thank yous coming through there. I had one question around the core knowledge curriculum, which I'm a big fan of. Has there been, and I'm not sure if you can answer this or someone else might be online to answer, but has there been any difficulty in using that in the Australian context with obviously requirements to teach the Victorian curriculum or the Australian curriculum in other parts of Australia? Has it been hard to fit that into the Australian or the Victorian curriculum so that the regulators, for instance, I know, would approve of it, I guess?
Yeah, it's a really good question and one that gets asked a lot. If we're going to take any silver linings with how vague the Australian curriculum and the Victorian curriculum are, it means you can do a lot to make the core knowledge curriculum fit. Yeah. So that's kind of been our approach, that rather than going, okay, we have to teach the Australian curriculum or we're teaching the Victorian curriculum, rather than that informing what we do, we have a really clear idea about what it is we do, and then we make that fit to the curriculum. So it
Sure.
certainly does require some thinking, and some of the sequencing. A big thing is with the core knowledge curriculum, a lot of the content we cover early, say in the first 3 years of school, doesn't appear in the curriculum until grade 4, 5 or 6. So sometimes the ordering of things and how you shuffle things around is a challenge. And there's obviously things that we have to teach that aren't in the core knowledge curriculum as well. But predominantly we're using that as our key focus. It does require a bit of shuffling around and some elaboration, but yeah, that's been our approach. Is this is what we want to teach and how we want to teach, and we'll make that fit with what we have to do.
Yeah, thank you. Great answer. Just a couple of questions before we go. We don't have time for too many, I'm sorry, but Ramya asks, just wanted to check if the scope and sequence is fluid and adjusted every term based on student needs that are made apparent by assessments.
No. So basically what's in our scope and sequence, we expect our students to be able to achieve, and we think that they're realistic expectations. And the idea is that we will scaffold the support we provide to students to get them to that point. So there's no real, I suppose, relaxing of what our expectations are based on what the students are able to do. Having said that, if we were way too ambitious in what we planned, obviously that would require some tweaking. And it's not set in stone. It will be reviewed from year to year and updated from year to year. But the idea is that we've said, you know, X number of units in word level reading and spelling can be covered this term. And so far we found it to be quite reasonable and pretty doable. Hopefully that answers that question.
Yep. Hazel asks, is the language of numeracy targeted as you cover history, geography, English and science?
Fabulous question, Hazel. Not yet, but it will be. So we've just started a recent focus on vocabulary. We've started with the low-hanging fruit, I suppose, because we've had the vocabulary scope and sequence quite readily developable through our core knowledge units. But that will be one of our next points of focus, is really fleshing that out. We do have attention to it in our unit planners and lesson plans, and the idea is that teachers will list the core vocabulary for each lesson, but we haven't worked on creating a full scope and sequence on that.
Donna asks, is this the first she's heard of the core knowledge curriculum? Is this something familiar to everyone? You can look it up and it is free. So Donna, I think get online and have a look for that. Probably the last question I'll ask of you from Lauren. She says, you mentioned that you're working with a group to bring an Australian perspective to the core knowledge curriculum. Is that at your school or for wider application? I think she's talking about the Indigenous work.
That's just at our individual school level, and that's just come about because the core knowledge curriculum has got a lot of American culture and American history, and we obviously want to teach to the Victorian curriculum, but also make sure that we're representing our Indigenous history in a way that's informed by First Nations people. So yeah, that's just at our individual school level, but that particular group is available to consult with schools, and they have a lot of great resources.
We just might finish with a word from Pamela Snow, who says, fabulous, Emina, well done. Imagine if this was routine practice across the board. And there's about 7 dots after that. And that's a great note to finish on. Thanks, Pam. Thanks so much, Emina. That was absolutely incredible tonight. I really appreciate all the work that you put into that and all the work that you're doing and that your school is doing. Next week, we've got Dr. Nathaniel Swain from Think Forward Educators, and he'll be presenting on the science of learning and how we can get that, shift the conversation around that to get it more mainstream. So look forward to next week, and thanks for your attendance this evening. And I hope to see you back next week. Thank you.